Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Well, Matt, last week we had perhaps the most momentous trial in the history of the United States and maybe on this continent, at least since Peter Zinger, when we were a colony. We're probably not going to take a deep dive into the trial, but you really had some thoughts about what does this mean for the compliance profession and how should a compliance professional take away some of the lessons and fallout from this trial moving forward? I'm not sure if that captures your thoughts, but I'm going to leave it at that and ask you to pick it
Well,
up from there.
sure. For everybody listening, Tom and I are, of course, talking about Donald Trump's criminal conviction last week on 34 felony counts of falsifying business records in the interests of committing a different felony, which was election interference. And Tom, I have to say, I think this issue, this trial, compliance officers, in at least in an academic sense, and probably even in a substantive sense, they should love this trial. And frankly, I think this outcome. I think the trial speaks to compliance officers in three specific ways. First, let's remember that at its fundamentals, this whole issue was an internal controls offense. Donald Trump falsified business records to cover up a crime. That is pretty much the heart of every FCPA enforcement action anybody has ever talked about, certainly on this podcast, in my newsletter, and all the other outreach that you've done, Tom. This is what compliance officers care about: accurate business records to reflect good ethical conduct. And even just on the mechanics of it, this case speaks to what compliance officers think about. Second, I think what's interesting is now we have this looming question in the case about whether Trump will be sentenced to prison time. I believe he could be sentenced to as long as 4 years in prison. I do not think he will get 4 years. But this all really comes down to a question now of consequence management and consistent enforcement of discipline, because he is not the first by a long stretch. He is not the first executive to be convicted in a New York state court of falsifying business records to cover up another crime. So this is also something compliance officers talk about all the time. And then third, a bit more esoterically, I suppose, I think that this case says a lot about leadership. How did Donald Trump lead his employees? Michael Cohen, former counsel and personal attorney and fixer for Donald Trump, and Alan Weisselberg, former CFO for the Trump Organization, both of whom have either served in prison, Michael Cohen, or are currently in prison, Alan Weisselberg. So how did Trump lead his people through these sordid allegations of covering up a crime of election interference and covering up his affair with the porn star Stormy Daniels? What did he inspire them to do? What did he tell them to do? It is a powerful reminder, I think, that leaders are not just responsible for what they say, because I don't think Donald Trump ever expressly said, please go falsify these business records to cover up my hush money payments to a porn star so I can win an election. I didn't go through the entire trial transcript, but I don't believe that expressly came up. But what did he say? And then what, on the other hand, did they hear as he dealt with them? And, again, it comes down to what does a leader say and what do other people hear? And those are the three big lessons, I think, from the Trump conviction last week. We could geek out on all of those, each one for half an hour if we wanted.
So I do want to take each one of those on a deeper dive, Matt, but I had three that I had written down that I wanted to throw in the mix as well. As a lawyer, I have to talk about the rule of law and how important that is. And that rule of law will be applied by a court of law if required. Number two, storytelling. I thought the prosecution told a very compelling story with not only their witnesses, but their witness selection and their witness schedule so that they could put their weakest witness, Michael Cohen, at the end to basically confirm all of the other story or testimony which had come before him. And then number three, it struck me that we often say in the FCPA world, you have to find the pot of money. And here there had to be a pot of money created to pay off Stormy Daniels. And that pot of money came or was documented in two exhibits, 35 and 36, plaintiff exhibits, which Alan Weisselberg wrote out how they were going to fund the money that was paid to Stormy Daniel and how it was going to flow through Cohen's account. So we had the documentation of the creation of the pot of money. I really do like your 3 points, and let's maybe take a deep dive into internal controls.
Well, I think actually my point about internal controls and your point about finding the pot of money are essentially the same. We should remember that, ultimately, where did this pot of money come from? It came from Michael Cohen taking out a HELOC loan on his house without telling his wife, which is crazy, period. But even crazier when you think he was doing that to bail out his boss, whom he knew to have a long history of not repaying his creditors. And Cohen knew that because he was the guy that Trump sent to intimidate the creditors and tell them, we're not going to pay you. But he ultimately first created the money from that. And then came this woven tapestry of falsified documents where they covered that up by saying that the expenses were legal fees. And that's how Cohen was going to get reimbursed. And I do think that the most damning piece along those lines was there's at least the one exhibit, I don't know which one it was, it might have been one of the two you mentioned there, Tom, where there is the document that shows Alan Weisselberg's handwriting on it, explaining the breakdown of how they would cover up the falsified records and cover up the hush money payment that ultimately, when Cohen got reimbursed for his loan that he took out to pay off Stormy Daniels. But this goes straight to one of the fundamentals of effective internal control is that there is documentation and there are records and books and records to show that corporate assets are being used as intended and as instructed by management. That is not at all what was happening here. They were covering up the fact that Michael Cohen was using his own money to pay off Stormy Daniels, and then the company was using its money to pay him back on legal fees when really it was just a bribe that was going to be there to keep her quiet. We could dork out about that as much as we want, I suppose, but really my point is just simply to show how this case really is kind of like an FCPA case. It is a corporate bribery and corruption case. It doesn't involve foreign officials. It involves private individuals. And is Trump at that time, is he a public figure or public official or not? He was a presidential candidate. But that's all this is. This is an internal controls case, falsified records to cover up a crime. We report about that every week with false spreadsheets and false invoices and sham consulting agreements and bogus email addresses. We have talked about that FCPA stuff for years and years. This is just another version of what we have always talked about with effective internal controls or the lack thereof.
Matt, I also like your lesson on consequence management, and perhaps I could tie that a little bit into the rule of law, but the compliance professional, the chief compliance officer, is the holder of the flame of institutional justice and institutional fairness within a corporation. In a court of law, that's the judge. Here, the judge is going to make a determination on sentencing, but in many ways, the chief compliance officer may be doing that internally, at least in conjunction with or in discussions with others, HR or other senior executives. And for me, the biggest importance, the most important component for the chief compliance officer is transparency and consistency. If you fire people in Brazil for cheating on their expense account, and the next week your top salesperson in the United States is determined to have cheated on their expense account or lied on their expense account, you have to institute the same justice for both, or you have inconsistency, which will destroy your program. So I really took your words around consequence management. It's not simply that there will be consequences, but those consequences have to be consistent throughout your organization. And that's really what I would hope one of the lessons a chief compliance officer would take away from this situation.
I think so too. And I look at it more through the lens of, is the offender, who in this case is Mr. Trump, but let's say hypothetically the offender is somebody who committed messaging violations at your firm. They have been caught. They have been proven to have engaged in the violations. And then the offender shows no remorse whatsoever for their conduct. They basically say, I don't care what your investigation has found. This is baloney. This has been rigged. This is a fraud. And you, the investigator, the compliance officer, the HR director, the lawyer, the whomever, you are corrupt and you're in on the scam. Imagine the offender said that in a corporate world. Would you really keep him on the payroll for even another hour? You would bounce that person out immediately. And I do think that the lack of contrition here, the lack of reticence, or the lack of taking responsibility for your offenses, I think that must matter. And that should factor into what Judge Marchand is going to decide. We should remember that, yes, in New York State and in New York County in particular, in New York City, people are charged with this offense on a regular basis. Yes, they are charged with the felony account because they have falsified business records to cover up a crime. Yes, people in the past have been accused and convicted of this when the crime was actually election interference. One good example that I dug up was the former controller for New York City back around the early 2000s or early 2010s was Alan Hevesi, who was convicted and who went to jail for this. I mean, I come to the conclusion that if we are serious about consequence management, then yes, actually, Donald Trump should be looking at some sort of prison time, not necessarily at Rikers or Singh, but in some sort of detention custody in one of his towers in, I don't know, New York or Mar-a-Lago or somewhere. But it is hard to see how you could not try to impose some sort of custody and then with a straight face tell everybody else in the world, no, when you make these offenses, though, you go to prison. That's not serious consequence management. I do not envy Judge Marchand's task here. I realize how difficult it is and frankly, how dangerous it could be for him personally if he sentences Trump to prison. But nonetheless, if we are talking about consistent enforcement of discipline, that's the sort of thing that matters. And, if you think about this in a corporate context, if you didn't enforce serious, severe consequences to somebody who behaved like Trump has for a corporate offense, the compliance team would be a laughingstock and nobody would take it seriously. You would fire that employee the moment they behave like that. And I'm hard pressed to see how you couldn't do something similar in the criminal context here with Trump, given all of his behavior and his problems.
So how about leadership, Matt? What should a compliance professional or maybe even a senior executive draw on that score from this trial or maybe the whole situation?
Oh, see, on that, I go back a little bit further to when Michael Cohen, after he was sentenced to prison and served in prison, and then he was called to testify before Congress, I think it was in 2018. And at that point, he had seen the light, so to speak. The scales had fallen off his eyes about just what sort of a person Donald Trump is. And he was no longer a fan of Donald Trump. And he talked a lot about how Donald Trump would communicate his intentions to Cohen about go stiff this contractor, go intimidate that other person, go do this, go do that. And Cohen said to effect that Trump never really expressly said this. He only talked in these vague illusions, that he wanted to do this, he wanted to see that happen, wouldn't it be a shame if something else happened. He used a lot of figures of speech. He behaved pretty much like mob bosses on all of these, ridiculous movies and Law and Order episodes that we see, because I think Trump styles himself as a mob boss, except probably not real ones, just the ones he sees in the movies. But he would behave like that, where he wouldn't directly say what he'd want. He would allude to what he wanted. And that has stuck with me for a long time because somebody else, and I wish I knew who, had described it as a leader is not just responsible for what they say. A leader is responsible for what other people hear them say. Now, in the ideal world, those would be the same because you would be so clear about what you want that there would be no discretion, and you would be so thoughtful in your words as well that there wouldn't be any room for these subjective interpretations. But that is absolutely what Trump embraced was this opacity, these obfuscations, there's these allusions to other things and turns of phrase and whatnot. And then eventually, these days, seems to me, it's turned into just verbal diarrheas that I couldn't tell you what he's trying to say on any day of the week. But that's something that leaders in particular have to think about. If you want to be ethical, then you have to think through, what am I saying? To whom? How will they interpret my remarks? And think that through long and hard, and then speak. And ideally, there would not be any room for misinterpretation or confusion. But that room for misinterpretation or confusion is how bad people justify doing bad things, which is what Cohen did back when he was a fixer for Trump. And look what happened to him. He served a lot of time. I guess he lost a lot of money with Trump as well. And he's become, a disgrace. He's trying to redeem himself now, but still, Cohen disgraced himself by embracing Trump's style of leadership.
So I would like to maybe say a few words about what I saw in terms of storytelling, Matt, because I think it's important for every chief compliance officer to understand you may be talking to multiple audiences. If you're involved in an internal investigation, you may be putting a report together for the board. You may be putting a report together that will go to the Department of Justice. Conceivably, you could be putting a report together that could form the basis of a deferred prosecution agreement or even a criminal trial if it ever went that far. So I would ask compliance professionals to think about the multiple audiences that they may be talking to and how they can tie both the strategic concepts that the prosecution tried to lay out in their case with the tactical specific pieces of evidence that they used. And this was a evidence heavy case in terms of emails and text rather, recorded phone messages and other documents. So there's lots of ways to tell a story, both from a strategic and a tactical level. Any real thoughts on that from your perspective?
Well, I would maybe pick up on that thread from the other direction and look at the core storytelling from Trump's defense attorney, Todd Blanche, who is an accomplished attorney who also demanded, I heard, a $3 million fee upfront in an escrow account to make sure he got paid. But, Todd Blanche, he did a terrible job, not because he's a bad lawyer, but because he had a bad client who insisted on a bad story. That Trump insisted he has never had an affair with Stormy Daniels, never had an affair with Karen McDougal, never did this, never did that. Everything's perfect, as it always is with Donald Trump. And if Trump had just come forward with a story, something more like, yes, I had an affair with Stormy Daniels. Yes, I've had a checkered past, but I was embarrassed by that. And so I didn't want that to come out with my new wife. And I didn't know that I asked Michael to take care of this. And while Michael was doing that, he was actually robbing me too. Maybe if they had told a different story that accepted some of the patently obvious truths here, Trump might have won over the jury. I mean, we should all remember that while Michael Cohen was paying off Stormy Daniels and rearranging, the payoff that he could get by falsifying the Trump Organization business records so he could get reimbursed. While all of that was happening, he was also taking money from Donald Trump. Michael Cohen was robbing Donald Trump while he was bailing Trump out with Stormy Daniels. He is not a good witness. And I agree with you, Tom, that it was smart of the prosecution to put him on last. But there were avenues for Trump to get an acquittal here, except his story in his own mind was that he was perfect. He walks on water. He didn't do anything that everybody knows he did, including the 12 jurors who have now convicted him. And it was really just striking to me, talk about like a bad client who insists on a bad set of alternate facts. And then people turn around and wonder, we're supposed to be surprised that Todd Blanche did a bad job and then they wound up with a bad outcome. How else was this going to go? And Trump just couldn't let it go and couldn't confront the story the way it really is and push it towards his own end. So I don't have much sympathy for him and his conviction right now.
If Todd Blanche got $3 million for that, he was way underpaid for him to put up with that in terms of his reputational damage going forward. So there turns out there was a lot of lessons from this, and I hope the compliance professionals out there will really take this to heart and consider the lessons that can be learned from a wide variety of areas outside of your own company and outside of FCPA compliance, because I see them in lots of different places. Any final thoughts, Matt?
Tom, I just wanted to pick up one more point about you mentioned the importance of the rule of law, because, of course, the conviction came down and Republican lawmakers promptly went apoplectic, talking about how it is now time for their Republican district attorneys and their Republican attorneys general to go and prosecute Democratic offenders. As if that is a bad idea. I mean, if there are Democratic officials out there who are breaking the law, they should be prosecuted because that is what the rule of law means. And we might point out that, Tom, as you and I are talking today, this Democratic administration is A, prosecuting the president's own son, and B, prosecuting the Democratic senator from New Jersey, Bob Menendez, and C, has just indicted a Texas Democratic representative, Henry Cuellar. I can't pronounce his last name
Quayar.
off the top. Cuellar, thank you. But I mean, of course, Democratic political figures should be prosecuted if they have committed crimes. This is not the threat that I think Republicans think it is. If they want to try and weaponize government, as they have, I mean, they said they were going to do that when they got elected in 2022 and retook the House, and they were going to impeach Joe Biden just for the hell of it. And I mean, they haven't, because he hasn't done anything wrong. If people find something wrong, then the law says you should be prosecuted. Those offenders should be prosecuted. That's all this was. And if you want to view it through a partisan lens, that is a particularly blinkered lens to look through, but you are at least looking in the right direction. I am not intimidated or scared off one bit by Republicans foaming at the mouth saying this is going to lead to mass prosecutions of people. If there are mass numbers of politicians breaking the law, then go right ahead. That is the way it is supposed to be. That is the rule of law, which last time I checked, compliance officers were supposed to be fans of.
Matt, that seems like a good place to end this episode. Can't wait to see what next week brings us.
Thank you, Tom.